June 10, 1940. Mussolini stands on the balcony of Palazzo Venezia in Rome, his chest puffed out before the assembled crowd, declaring war on Britain and France. The Mediterranean, that ancient sea that had witnessed the rise and fall of empires since before recorded history, was about to become a crucial theater in humanity's most devastating conflict. As the Italian dictator's words echoed across the piazza, across the sea in North Africa, in Berlin and in London, the gears of strategic planning shifted. What none of the architects of war fully grasped in that moment was that the decision to expand the conflict into the Mediterranean basin would ultimately prove to be one of the most consequential strategic errors of the Axis powers, a critical miscalculation that would drain vital resources, divide focus, and ultimately contribute significantly to Hitler's defeat. The Mediterranean strategy, with its seductive promise of striking at the British Empire's lifeline through Egypt and the Suez Canal, would become a dark, consuming vortex from which Nazi Germany could never fully extract itself, even as the war's center of gravity shifted elsewhere. The tale of how the Mediterranean theater became Hitler's strategic undoing begins not with grand battles, but with cold numbers on logistics tables and maps spread across planning rooms in Berlin. In the summer of 1940, following the fall of France, Germany stood at a crossroads. The original Nazi strategy had never envisioned a prolonged Mediterranean campaign. Hitler's geopolitical vision, as outlined in Mein Kampf and in countless private conversations recorded by his inner circle, had always looked eastward, toward the Soviet Union, where he sought Lebensraum, living space for the German people. The Mediterranean was an afterthought, a secondary theater that became increasingly important only after Britain refused to negotiate following the fall of France, and after Mussolini's impetuous entry into the conflict forced Hitler's hand. What began as a limited commitment to shore up a faltering ally would evolve into a massive diversion of resources that Germany could ill afford to spare. Lieutenant Colonel Wilhelm Schaefer stood in the map room of OKW headquarters in Berlin, his eyes scanning the immense strategic map of Europe, North Africa, and the Middle East that dominated the wall. At 47, Schaefer was older than most of his colleagues in the operations planning section, his experience stretching back to the Great War, where he had served as a junior logistics officer on the Western Front. The lessons of that conflict, particularly regarding the critical importance of supply chains, had been burned into his consciousness during the terrible attrition battles of 1916–1918. Now, in October 1940, he watched with growing unease as red pins indicating German commitments multiplied across North Africa and the Balkans. "It is becoming a hemorrhage," he remarked quietly to General Jodl, who stood beside him reviewing the latest situation reports. "Every division we send to Africa or Greece is a division not available for Barbarossa." Jodl nodded grimly but said nothing. Both men knew that Hitler had already made his decisions, and that strategic objections from the General Staff were increasingly unwelcome. The reality that Schaefer and other German logistics planners understood, but which Hitler seemed determined to ignore, was that Germany lacked the maritime capacity to properly sustain large-scale operations across the Mediterranean. The Reich had entered the war with a surface fleet entirely inadequate for the challenge of supplying forces in North Africa. While the Kriegsmarine had concentrated on building the submarine force that would wreak havoc in the Battle of the Atlantic, the task of maintaining supply lines to Libya fell primarily to the Italian merchant marine and navy, both of which would prove inadequate to the task. The Mediterranean, dominated by British naval power operating from Gibraltar, Malta, and Alexandria, became a graveyard for Axis shipping. By 1941, nearly 70% of all supplies dispatched to support Rommel's Afrika Korps were being lost to British submarines, surface vessels, and aircraft operating from Malta. Men, machines, fuel, and ammunition that Germany could not afford to lose were disappearing beneath the blue waters of the Mediterranean at an alarming rate. Major Hans Dietrich of the Wehrmacht's Transport Division stood on the docks of Naples in the sweltering heat of July 1942, watching as the latest convoy prepared to depart for Tripoli. The scene before him was one of controlled chaos. Italian stevedores struggled to load the hodgepodge of German and Italian vehicles, crates of ammunition, barrels of precious fuel, and the 1,000 other items required by modern mechanized forces. Dietrich's assignment was straightforward, but nearly impossible. Ensure that General Rommel received the supplies he needed to maintain his offensive into Egypt. The sunburned, exhausted officer had long since abandoned the neat, pressed uniform that had been his pride in the early days of the war. Now he wore the same dust-stained, sweat-soaked clothes for days on end as he fought his own desperate battle against the limitations of physics, bureaucracy, and enemy action. How much fuel made it through on the last convoy? Dietrich asked his Italian liaison officer, Captain Romano. The Italian's expressive face told the story before his words did. Perhaps 40% of what was sent, Major. British aircraft from Malta caught the convoy south of Pantelleria. 3 ships sunk, 2 damaged. Dietrich cursed under his breath. The pattern was always the same. Every ton of supplies required multiple tons to be shipped, knowing that so much would be lost en route. And fuel was the most precious commodity of all. Without it, Rommel's tanks and trucks would become useless metal coffins in the desert. Already, the advance into Egypt was consuming fuel at rates well beyond what was reaching the front. Dietrich knew, as did every logistics officer from Naples to El Alamein, that the Great Desert Campaign was being lost not primarily in battles of maneuver, but in the mundane arithmetic of supply tables, where the numbers simply did not add up to victory. The Mediterranean commitment represented a fundamental strategic error for Nazi Germany, one that Hitler compounded repeatedly as the war progressed. Each time the Führer found himself at a decision point, he chose to increase rather than reduce German involvement in the theater. The initial deployment of the Afrika Korps in February 1941 was meant to be limited, just enough German forces to prevent the complete collapse of the Italians in Libya. But as Rommel achieved early successes, Hitler was drawn deeper into the commitment. Following the German intervention in Greece and Yugoslavia in April 1941, forces that might have been used for the coming invasion of the Soviet Union were instead scattered across the Mediterranean basin. The postponement of Operation Barbarossa by several crucial weeks due to the Balkan campaign would later prove catastrophic, as German forces found themselves fighting in Russian winter conditions they were ill-prepared to endure. In Moscow, as the first snows of what would prove to be an unusually harsh winter began to fall in November 1941, General Heinz Guderian stood shivering in the open hatch of his command vehicle, binoculars trained on the Soviet positions just visible through the swirling snow. The temperature had fallen to 20 degrees below zero, and already his panzer divisions were experiencing catastrophic mechanical failures as lubricants froze and metal became brittle in the extreme cold. Guderian, the master of mobile warfare, found his forces immobilized not primarily by enemy action, but by weather and logistics. As he surveyed the bleak landscape, his mind returned to a heated planning meeting months earlier, where he had argued vehemently against the diversion of resources to the Mediterranean. For every tank we send to Africa, he had warned, we will wish we had 3 more in Russia. Now with Moscow visible on the horizon but increasingly unattainable, the cost of Hitler's Mediterranean obsession was becoming brutally apparent. The divisions deployed to support Mussolini in North Africa and Greece, the air assets diverted to the Mediterranean theater, the fuel and supplies being lost in the blue waters between Italy and Libya, all were now desperately needed on the frozen approaches to the Soviet capital. The strain of the two-front war became increasingly apparent in the allocation of Germany's most critical resource, combat aircraft. The Luftwaffe, unlike the Wehrmacht, could not be everywhere at once. Every fighter squadron deployed to North Africa or Sicily to protect convoys and support Rommel was unavailable for operations in Russia or for the defense of German cities against the growing Allied strategic bombing campaign. By mid-1942, this strain had become critical. Air superiority, which had been a cornerstone of German victory in the early war years, was slipping away as Luftwaffe resources were spread too thinly across too many theaters. The Mediterranean, with its voracious appetite for air cover to protect vulnerable shipping, became a black hole for German air assets that were desperately needed elsewhere. Field Marshal Erhard Milch, responsible for Luftwaffe production and allocation, described the situation in a private memo to Göring as bleeding the Reich white through 1,000 cuts. Oberst Werner Freytag, commanding a depleted fighter group in Sicily in August 1942, received the latest replacement schedule with a mixture of resignation and bitter humor. 6 new pilots and 4 replacement aircraft next month, he told his executive officer. 6 boys straight from flight school to replace the 15 veterans we've lost, and 4 new Bf-109s to replace the 17 we've had shot down or damaged beyond repair. The mathematics of attrition were implacable and increasingly unfavorable. The air war over the Mediterranean had become a meat grinder for the Luftwaffe, consuming planes and pilots at rates that German industry and training schools simply could not sustain. Meanwhile, the Allied air forces grew steadily stronger, their factories beyond the reach of German bombers, their training programs producing pilots faster than they could be shot down. Freytag knew that he was participating in a losing battle, one that was being replicated across every front where German forces were engaged. The Luftwaffe, once the most feared air force in the world, was being ground down by the simple arithmetic of industrial capacity and strategic overreach. Perhaps the most damning indictment of Hitler's Mediterranean strategy can be found in the allocation of Germany's elite forces. The Fallschirmjäger, the German paratrooper corps, had been among the most effective shock troops in the early war period. Their dramatic seizure of the Belgian fort of Eben-Emael in 1940 and the conquest of Crete in 1941 had demonstrated their effectiveness. But the high casualties sustained during the Crete operation convinced Hitler to abandon large-scale airborne operations for the remainder of the war. Instead of being employed as a strategic asset, the surviving Fallschirmjäger were increasingly used as elite infantry, committed piecemeal to crisis points across the Mediterranean. These highly trained troops, who might have made a strategic difference if massed for key operations on the Eastern Front, were instead scattered across Italy, Sicily, and North Africa, fighting desperate defensive battles against overwhelming Allied power. Major Karl Schmidt of the 1st Fallschirmjäger Division stood atop the ruins of an ancient Roman watchtower outside Tunis in April 1943, watching through binoculars as American tanks maneuvered in the distance. His battalion, like so many German units trapped in the North African endgame, was short of everything except courage. Ammunition was strictly rationed, fuel was nearly non-existent, food was down to minimal survival rations, and medical supplies had long since run out. What galled Schmidt was not the prospect of defeat that had become inevitable weeks ago, but the waste of it all. His paratroopers, men who had once dropped from the skies to spearhead the conquest of nations, were now reduced to fighting a hopeless delaying action in a campaign that had become strategically irrelevant. The real war, the decisive theater, was far to the north and east, where the titanic struggle with the Soviet Union was reaching its climax at places like Kursk. Yet here they were, Hitler's elite, trapped in a strategic cul-de-sac from which there would be no escape, no strategic purpose served by their sacrifice except to briefly delay the inevitable Allied victory in Africa. The Mediterranean strategy represented a fundamental misunderstanding by Hitler of his own strategic situation. Germany, with its limited resources and industrial capacity, could not afford to fight a dispersed, multi-theater war against opponents who collectively possessed overwhelming material advantages. The economic might of the United States, the vast manpower and space of the Soviet Union, and the global reach of the British Empire created a coalition that could only be defeated if Germany concentrated its forces for decisive victories on one front at a time. By allowing himself to be drawn into an expanding Mediterranean commitment, Hitler violated the basic military principle of concentration of force. The result was predictable to professional military planners, if not to the Führer himself. German power was diluted to the point where it could achieve decisive victory nowhere. In a bunker beneath the Reich Chancellery in Berlin, as Allied bombs fell on the city in February 1944, Colonel Schaefer, now promoted but no more influential than before, presented the latest resource allocation figures to a group of increasingly haggard general staff officers. The numbers told a stark story of strategic failure. Germany had lost over 200,000 troops captured in the Tunisia debacle the previous year, losses that could not be replaced. The Mediterranean campaign had consumed thousands of aircraft, hundreds of thousands of tons of precious fuel, and millions of rounds of ammunition, all diverted from the Eastern Front, where the Wehrmacht was now in full retreat. Italy, once Hitler's ally, had surrendered and was now another occupation burden requiring 25 German divisions to hold, divisions desperately needed elsewhere. The invasion of Sicily and Italy had opened the southern flank of Hitler's fortress Europe, forcing a defensive posture that stretched German resources even thinner ahead of the expected invasion in the west. As Schaefer concluded his presentation, the room remained silent. There was nothing to say. The strategic mistakes were now irreversible, the consequences unavoidable. The Mediterranean theater revealed another critical German weakness that would contribute significantly to ultimate defeat: the failure of intelligence and a persistent tendency towards self-deception. Throughout the Desert War, German intelligence consistently underestimated British strengths and overestimated the effectiveness of Axis operations. Rommel himself, for all his tactical brilliance, was repeatedly surprised by the scale of British logistics and reinforcement capabilities. The ultra-secret Allied cryptanalysis program, which had broken key German codes, allowed the British to anticipate Axis movements and convoy schedules, contributing to the devastating losses in men and materiel crossing the Mediterranean. The Germans, convinced of their own security protocols, never fully grasped how thoroughly their communications had been compromised. This intelligence failure was replicated across other theaters, but was particularly damaging in the Mediterranean, where superior Allied information repeatedly translated into devastating tactical advantages. Major Erich Weber of the Abwehr, the German military intelligence service, sat in his sparse office in Rome in December 1942, staring at the latest intelligence summary with growing disbelief and alarm. The British were massively reinforcing Egypt, with American equipment now flowing in alongside Imperial forces. Every convoy the Axis failed to intercept meant more tanks, more aircraft, more artillery pieces, facing Rommel's increasingly beleaguered Afrika Korps. What troubled Weber most was not just the material disparity, which had been evident for months, but the pattern of British operational movements. They seemed to anticipate German plans with uncanny accuracy, as if they were reading the Axis playbook in advance. Weber had raised the possibility of compromised communications multiple times, only to be assured by signal security experts that the Enigma encryption system was unbreakable, yet the evidence before him suggested otherwise. The Axis forces in the Mediterranean were fighting not just against superior numbers and logistics, but against an opponent who increasingly seemed to know their plans before they were executed. The Mediterranean campaign also exposed critical weaknesses in the Axis alliance itself. The partnership between Nazi Germany and Fascist Italy had been built more on ideological affinity than on sound strategic planning or complementary capabilities. Mussolini's impulsive decision to enter the war, made with little consultation with his German ally, immediately created strategic obligations that Hitler had not anticipated or prepared for. The Italian military, despite Mussolini's rhetoric, was inadequately equipped, poorly led, and fundamentally unready for modern warfare on the scale required. German forces were repeatedly diverted to shore up failing Italian operations in Greece, in North Africa, and ultimately in Sicily and the Italian mainland itself. By 1943, what had begun as an alliance of conquering powers had devolved into a relationship where German troops were effectively occupying their own allies' territory, creating additional security burdens and further stretching already inadequate resources. General Antonio Baldini of the Italian General Staff sat across from his German counterpart in a villa outside Rome in the spring of 1943, the atmosphere tense with unspoken recriminations and mutual distrust. The meeting had been called to coordinate the defense of Sicily against the expected Allied invasion, but both men knew they were discussing the arrangement of deck chairs on the Titanic. The Axis position in the Mediterranean had become untenable, and Sicily would inevitably fall. What concerned Baldini most was the growing German presence in northern Italy itself, ostensibly to help defend the mainland, but increasingly resembling an occupation force. Reports reached him daily of German units establishing independent command structures, requisitioning Italian resources without consultation, and preparing fallback positions that suggested they expected Italy to leave the war. He was right to be concerned. German planning was already well underway for Operation Axe, the disarming of the Italian military and seizure of the country in the event of an Italian surrender. The Axis partnership, built on fascist brotherhood and promises of shared empire, was ending as it had conducted the war, with strategic incoherence, mutual suspicion, and fatal disunity. Perhaps the most profound strategic error revealed by the Mediterranean campaign was Hitler's fundamental misunderstanding of the nature of maritime power. Germany entered the war as a continental power, with its primary strategic advantages lying in land warfare. The Mediterranean, by its very nature, was a maritime theater where sea control was the decisive factor. Britain, with centuries of experience in naval warfare and global maritime operations, held decisive advantages that Germany could never fully counter. The failure to eliminate Malta as a British base, through either invasion or sustained air attack, left a dagger pointed at the heart of Axis supply lines. The inability to effectively contest British naval supremacy in the eastern Mediterranean allowed the Commonwealth forces in Egypt to be continuously reinforced and supplied. Hitler, fixated on land conquest and continental dominance, never fully grasped how maritime power would ultimately prove decisive, not just in the Mediterranean, but in the war as a whole. Admiral Karl Dönitz, commander of the Kriegsmarine submarine force and later Hitler's successor as German leader, had argued repeatedly for a comprehensive maritime strategy that recognized Germany's fundamental weaknesses at sea. In a memorandum written in late 1940 but largely ignored, he warned, "We cannot defeat Great Britain by half measures in the Mediterranean. Either we commit the resources to eliminate their naval power there entirely, which would require an invasion of Malta, the capture of Gibraltar, and the deployment of major fleet units, or we should minimize our commitment to avoid wastage of resources. The current middle path, where we deploy enough forces to maintain a presence but not enough to achieve dominance, represents the worst of all strategic choices." Dönitz's warning proved prophetic. Germany committed enough resources to the Mediterranean to create a significant drain on its war effort elsewhere, but never enough to achieve the decisive results that might have justified the investment. The human cost of Hitler's Mediterranean strategy can be measured not just in the hundreds of thousands of German soldiers killed, wounded, or captured in the theater, but in the opportunities forever lost. The divisions mired in Tunisia in early 1943, when they surrendered en masse to the advancing Allies, represented irreplaceable combat power that might have bolstered the Eastern Front at a critical juncture. The aircraft lost defending Axis shipping or supporting ground operations in North Africa, and Italy might have helped stem the tide of Allied strategic bombing that was increasingly devastating German industrial capacity. The fuel consumed in the Mediterranean, much of it lost when tankers were sunk, represented mobility denied to German forces elsewhere. Each strategic choice has its consequence, and Hitler's choice to fight for the Mediterranean, rather than concentrate on the Eastern Front, had consequences that echoed through every subsequent phase of the war. Feldwebel Markus Bauer, of the 15th Panzer Division, would never forget the moment when he realized that the war was lost. It came not during the chaotic retreat from El Alamein, nor during the final surrender in Tunisia, but months later, as a prisoner of war in an American camp in Algeria. There, with time to reflect and information from new prisoners arriving from other fronts, the full scope of Germany's strategic failure became clear to him. "We were fighting for sand and rock in Africa while the real war was being decided in Russia," he would later write in a memoir. "Our panzers were breaking down for lack of spare parts in the desert, while American factories were producing more tanks each month than Germany could build in a year. We spoke of Fortress Europe, but we had allowed the enemy to choose where and when to strike at its walls." Bauer's realization, shared by many German officers as the war progressed, illuminated the fundamental strategic errors that Hitler had committed. By dispersing German power across multiple theaters, rather than concentrating for decisive victory, the Führer had violated the basic principles of warfare that had been understood by military thinkers since Clausewitz. As the Allied armies drove up the Italian peninsula through 1944, the Mediterranean theater transitioned from a contested battleground to a strategic backwater. The primary focus of both sides shifted to the titanic clashes in Normandy and the Eastern Front, where the fate of Nazi Germany would ultimately be decided. Yet, even in this late phase, Hitler continued to commit resources to the Mediterranean that he could ill afford to spare. The divisions tied down in Italy, fighting a skillful but ultimately futile delaying action against the advancing Allies, represented combat power that might have extended the defense of Germany itself. Even after the strategic rationale for defending Italy had evaporated with the successful Allied landings in France, Hitler's refusal to authorize a withdrawal to more defensible positions in the Alps extended the bleeding of German military resources. General Heinrich von Vietinghoff, who assumed command of German forces in Italy after Kesselring was transferred to the Western Front in March 1945, faced an impossible strategic situation. His armies were critically short of every necessity: fuel, ammunition, food, medical supplies, yet Hitler's orders forbade any significant withdrawal. The Alps, with their formidable natural defenses, offered the possibility of a prolonged resistance with minimal forces, potentially freeing divisions for the desperate defense of Germany itself. Yet the Führer's insistence on holding every meter of conquered territory, long after any strategic purpose was served, condemned thousands more German soldiers to death or captivity in a campaign that had lost all meaning. Vietinghoff, like so many German commanders in the war's final phases, was forced to execute orders that he knew were strategically bankrupt, sacrificing his men for Hitler's refusal to acknowledge reality. The Mediterranean campaign reveals a fundamental truth about Hitler's leadership that helps explain his ultimate defeat: his inability to distinguish between peripheral and central interests, between strategic necessities and ideological preferences. The Führer, who had once seemed a master of opportunistic geopolitics, became increasingly rigid as the war progressed, unable to adapt to changing circumstances or to prioritize Germany's limited resources for maximum effect. His insistence on fighting for every territory once conquered, regardless of its strategic value, transformed the Mediterranean from an opportunity into a trap, a resource sink that Germany could ill afford, but from which Hitler refused to extricate himself until it was far too late. This rigidity, this failure of strategic prioritization, would be replicated across every front as Germany retreated from its overextended empire, always committing just enough resources to ensure continuing losses, but never enough to reverse the tide. The final act of the Mediterranean drama played out in the spring of 1945, as Allied forces made their final push through the Po Valley toward the Alps. By then, the strategic outcome had long since been determined elsewhere, in the ruins of Berlin, in the shattered industrial cities of the Ruhr, on the banks of the Rhine and the Oder. Yet even in these final weeks, with the Third Reich collapsing around him, Hitler continued to issue orders to forces in Italy as if they might somehow affect the war's outcome. The Mediterranean, which had once figured so prominently in his strategic thinking, had become just another failure in a war characterized by increasingly catastrophic miscalculations. When German forces in Italy finally surrendered on May 2, 1945, just days before the general capitulation, it marked the end of a campaign that had consumed vast resources, diverted critical forces from more decisive theaters, and ultimately contributed significantly to Nazi Germany's total defeat. The Mediterranean strategy stands as a case study in how not to conduct grand strategy in a global conflict. Hitler, faced with limited resources and multiple enemies, chose to disperse rather than concentrate his forces, to expand rather than prioritize his fronts, and to pursue peripheral objectives at the expense of central ones. The result was a campaign that drained vital resources from the decisive theaters, particularly the Eastern Front, while never achieving the strategic objectives that might have justified such an investment. The divisions lost in North Africa and Italy, the aircraft destroyed over the Mediterranean, the fuel and supplies sunk between Naples and Tripoli, all represented combat power denied to the Wehrmacht, where it needed it most, against its most dangerous enemies. In a war characterized by difficult strategic choices and limited resources, Hitler consistently made the wrong decisions regarding the Mediterranean, turning what might have been a secondary theater into a bottomless pit of men and materiel that Germany could ill afford to lose. As we look back on the Mediterranean campaign from a historical perspective, its importance in Hitler's defeat becomes clear. While the final battles may have been fought elsewhere, the strategic errors committed in the decision to fight for North Africa, Sicily, and Italy contributed significantly to the ultimate outcome. The campaign reveals the essential weaknesses of Nazi strategic thinking: the failure to match ends with means, the inability to prioritize objectives, the tendency to make decisions based on prestige and ideology rather than sound military judgment. These same flaws would ultimately doom the Third Reich on a global scale, but they were visible first, and most clearly in the blue waters and harsh landscapes of the Mediterranean theater. If you have found this exploration of strategic failure illuminating, consider how it offers lessons not just for military history, but for any enterprise where resources are limited and choices have consequences. The Mediterranean campaign reminds us that even the most powerful military machine can be defeated not just by enemy action, but by its own strategic errors, by the thousand small decisions that collectively lead to disaster when they are not guided by a clear understanding of priorities, capabilities, and ultimate objectives. In the final analysis, Hitler lost the war not just because he faced superior resources and manpower, but because he failed to use what he had effectively, and nowhere was this failure more evident than in the fateful decision to commit Germany's limited power to the Mediterranean theater.